Well, welcome to Climate Courage. My name's Andrea Edwards.
I'm David Coe.
And at the far end, you have me, Richard Buccellato.
And I'm sorry, guys, it's now 7 a.m. for you, right?
Yeah, the Earth seems to have done a jitter somehow along the way. It's shoved us down.
It's actually 8 o'clock for me because I'm in France. So
that's okay. All right.
I got to sleep compared to David.
Yeah. So today we decided it was a really wonderful opportunity to talk about the air we breathe. And I'm going to introduce you to an amazing lady. And I'm just going to say, I'm going to introduce you to Khun Weena. And here she is. She's in Bangkok, Thailand. And we met on LinkedIn. And I think we somehow found each other, but I can't remember how. But welcome, Weena. All right. Well, we lost. Oh, wait a minute. I'll get you. You're on mute. There you go.
Okay.
Here we are.
There we are.
Hello. Thanks for having me on this program.
Pleasure.
It's great. And if you look at actually what's happening at the moment, I know it's not too polluted in Bangkok at the moment, but in Lahore just yesterday, they announced hundreds of people are in the emergency rooms at hospitals with pollution problems, and they've well exceeded 1,000, whatever that measurement is, of the amount of particulates in the air. And I think for a lot of people around the world, you might experience like maybe fire, the smoke from fire and that pollution. But when you actually get into a really hazy environment, it's a really horrible thing. I've experienced it in Singapore. I've experienced it in Thailand. Your eyes itch. I mean, in China in 2006, I remember I felt like I had poison dripping down the back of my throat the whole time. So, I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. But first of all, tell us about you.
Okay. So I'm an economist and a finance professional by training. So I've worked in different fields. I started life actually in investment banking, and then moved into portfolio management and then private equity, specifically with the World Bank Group. So with the private sector arm of the World Bank Group from the International Finance Corporation. So doing investments in very interesting parts of the world. And it was just time to come home. So I came back to Thailand, always wanted to get involved in sustainability. And I still am involved in that space, definitely. But particularly related to, so I'm with the World Bank Group currently. So I do a lot of work right now, currently focused on governance issue. Previously, I was doing stuff related to private sector development policy work for Thailand, as well as for SME analysis work as well. So now, in relation to the air pollution side of things, this all kind of happened kind of accidentally about 7 years ago. I've always been cognizant that air quality is not the best, I was actually training for. At that point, I wanted to run for the Paris Marathon, and I was training at the end of the year. And it was, it's usually a cooler time of the year, a good time if you're a runner. You like to be out and about running. And I started noticing I was having these really terrible headaches, just weren't going away. And they were like really, really painful migraines, right? And I could not function. I couldn't work. I was taking, headache medicine. It just wasn't going away. So I started digging around, looking online, checking on, air quality measures. And it was showing levels that were quite alarming. But the worst part was that it took about maybe 2 to 3 weeks from when I noticed I myself had health impact, when the government started warning people, saying, this cool air outside that you guys are experiencing, and this it's actually polluted air.
Wow.
And my family, I've got nephews who get really terrible nosebleeds, and they get it every air pollution season. So that it sort of really came from, at a personal level, just thinking, well, I just need to have that basic information to work on. I need to make basic life decisions, and I don't even have that. And I think I was also aware of particulate matter 2.5. I had joined a sort of a workshop run by an NGO, and they were talking about this. And I knew that PM 2.5 wasn't included in the air quality index in Thailand. And I knew they were not measuring it for factories. That I didn't know, right? But I thought, with my knowledge, I could be able to protect myself. Actually not, because the times that I go running in the morning is actually one of the worst times for particulate matters, things like that. So it all started with me saying, hey, this problem is really big, people. We all need to breathe. there will be people who's working on this, right? So when around looking around, and then it's like you're doing it on the fringes, right? So the government would start like spraying water here in Bangkok when air quality gets bad, which doesn't actually do anything, or they'll say, just put on a mask, and I'm like, but it's much bigger than that. So it sort of started with me asking around, and then sort of and then joining forces with a lot of people who are independently trying to do something quite concerned. So our core group has about 9 people right now, sort of in the real core group. But we work in a big network, so our network is much, much bigger than that. But I have in my team, I've got environmental lawyers, I've got human rights lawyer, I've got a solid team, about 4 or 5 lawyers in the team. I've got a medical doctor who's also a human anthropologist by training. Phenomenal. I've also got an incredible environmental economist in our team. I've got mass communications people. We also work collaboratively with air pollution specialists. And because, this issue is so complex, it's so multifaceted, it cuts across so many industry, and you do need experience from so many different people to try to solve this, because at the end of the day, it's a massive structural problem in Thailand, but it's also a global issue.
Yeah.
And then that's what piques my interest, because it's like, this is something much, much bigger. One of my colleagues described it as, you think you have a cold, but it's actually the early signs of cancer, but we're still treating it like it's just a cold. Right? It's much, much more serious. So that's sort of how we started, and we looked into how do we touch this, how do we tackle this. A lot of my co-founders are quite experienced, and they've looked into this. So we started from the beginning. We said, we'll touch what no one wants to do. We'll do the things that is so too difficult, but it's necessary, and that is to push on legislation, because Thailand doesn't have a clean air legislation at all.
Yeah.
And so,
all right. So we are going to dig into this in a lot more detail, but first, let's focus on the big environmental news that's happening this week. And of course, how can we talk about anything other than the US election? And I want to go first this time. So I've said for a few weeks, I think it's absolutely going to be a Kamala win. 310 to 312 was my prediction, but I think that's what Trump looks like he might be ended up getting. So, and I've obviously spent a few days since the election just really digging into how could I have gotten it wrong? And there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment, and I don't think the outcome will change no matter what. One of the big things that's happening is the discussion about the number of votes. So Biden won in 2020 with 81,000 and Trump got 74,000. Trump got less in 2024 with 72.5 million, not thousand, 72.5 million, but Kamala only got basically 68 million. And so that's the question. Where are those 20 million votes? Where have they gone? So there's a lot of things going on there. There's about 330 legal cases I've heard. But I think what's more important is, well, first of all, I think it's really important that if you missed this outcome, understanding why, which is what I've spent a lot of time trying to do. But the other side of it is I try not to get involved in US domestic policies. I think we're going to see some pretty horrible and sad things happening over the coming years within the country. But it's the bigger global impact when it comes to the climate. We've got COP26, 28, 29, yeah, coming up. And there's quite a few international leaders have already said they're not going to be attending. So it kind of almost feels like that's but everyone's giving up on COP, including the activists. I mean, I think Greta, said something about it just being a useless event. But I know, David, do you want to kick us off? What do you think when you look at the impacts of the US election on moving forward from a climate perspective?
Well, COP29 starts Monday. So, the US election obviously is very relevant because Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. That's kind of like, one of the things that he did. And Biden immediately came back in. And I'm pretty sure that as soon as he gets settled, he's going to pull out again. And that's very relevant and he'll probably pull out of the UNFCCC altogether, and he will probably restrict funding to the UN as well. His policy is very, very simple. If we got money, we're going to spend it internally, And where we don't have money, we're going to impose tariffs in other places and tell the world that they got to pay their share in this, which in some sense, is a reasonable thing. He did that with NATO, and he said, look, if you guys don't pay 2% of your GDP, you're not going to have a NATO. And I checked yesterday, and pretty much all countries, except for maybe a handful, are on that 2% at the moment. And that's entirely as a result of him told, look, you're not going to have NATO if you don't actually pay for that in that way. With COP, the issue, and the climate agenda, the issue is that people have been thinking they can solve this with money. And this really dates back, if we go back over its history, to kind of the thoughts in the 70s that really we can fix this by, getting ahead of the problem, and money will help us get ahead of that problem. And the development across different regions of the world will help us. And that actually goes into, the most important thing we do every day. What's the most important thing we do every day? It's the air we breathe. That's the most important thing that we do every day, everybody, everywhere. And it goes into that too, because it's part of the contributory process of exactly how we get into this thing. So we're going to find that the calls for the trillions is actually not going to meet anyone saying we can pay. Because so far it's been expecting that US will somehow pay for this because they're the richest country. If they pull off the process, other countries will look at it and say, we're poor, money's not coming, what's the point? Other rich countries say, shit, we're going to be lumbered with all of the bill. We can't afford to do that. What are we going to do? So it's really significant as a move, because it does go back down to what are you calling for? Here's where we, Richard and I, tend to take a slightly different view, in fact, a radically different view from the climate agenda per se. We say that it's not about fixing climate change, because we're already too late for that. Is right in front of us. Thailand, the temperatures that you have there, it's almost impossible for people to work outside for parts of the year. The storms that have been hitting the US and all of those things, they're all climate change in that way. It's about understanding what it means for people to thrive in all their different places. What is it that gives them that connection to each other, to the environment around them, to their own dignity about what thriving is. And that is different from a call for money. So until we have that switch along for me in this sort of climate agenda, we are going to keep thinking it's about more technology, it's about more economy, when really it's about how we all connect with each other in this case. So in that sense, it's a forcing it along into the direction, but I've always felt that climate change will force it, and the way it forces it is that it makes our cost of living increase. It just increases the cost when your house has just been damaged by storms, whether it's a window that's been blown out or whatever it is, it costs you to fix it. And your insurance is going to go up, and when you apply for the insurance to try and help, and next year is going to go on up. And when regions like Thailand, which produces a lot of rice for the world, sees the temperature problems and in fact the air quality, so you can't work outside and all those things, which is also related to a lot of the problems that contribute to this climate situation, you're going to find costs increasing. So for me, what it is we're heading down a direction I've felt for a while that we will end up going down. The individual players will come, they will differ in their names, but the situation is actually global. And the only real response is how people themselves go along and say, it's not a question of nation versus nation. It's a question of how we as people of the planet feel about our planet.
Richard?
Yeah, not surprisingly, I tend to share, David's views. I think if we're looking at the election outcome, I think it's probably a very good thing that we will not drag this through courts and have a sort of a stalemate over the next couple of months. Because I think on the face of it, Trump's margin is decisive enough that it will not be in dispute that he won. And I think that's a good thing. Because the worst thing would be a world effectively in limbo because you don't know who's going to take charge in January. But obviously the agendas from Harris and Trump are very different. And like David said, I think Trump taking charge will actually force a lot of these issues And I'm trying to be quite optimistic here, because I think there is a path of optimism in all this, that we are effectively going to close the door to government intervention and government legislation because there isn't any money. And US certainly will not be the ones paying. I think that is fairly clear from the whole agenda Trump is rolling out. And that will actually force the responsibility onto individuals globally to say, okay, there is no money coming and it's here in front of us. How do we approach it and what can we actually do? And that, for me, if it was to happen, would be a very good thing, because ultimately it is all about individual responsibility and not shying away from it. Then we can argue what this means politically around the world, etc. But I think that's a different story. But we are going to see a US that becomes far more domestically focused and is in some ways going to abandon the role of the global police that we, certainly in my lifetime, have grown accustomed to seeing a backstop that has been governed through NATO by the US. And I think that will probably also change. And I'm unsure what that means, to be honest.
Weena, what do you think? You're on mute.
Yeah, it's uncertain times. I guess it always begs the very first question, and I'm glad I'm not a parent of a young child in the US. How do you answer the question of how does somebody with 34 felony counts still pending still be qualified even to have the name on the ballot? I mean, that's a very simple question from the very start, right? I mean, the whole governance structure is in question. I also think, looking at the US politics, people, I think in the US in general, are just sick of this big money politics, this two-party duopoly that's just covering everything, and a sense of their voices aren't being heard. So I think part of what's happening is a sense of you're not listening to what we really want. Somebody who's, so since the previous election, I was quite disappointed with the Democratic National Convention about their choices of who to put on the ballot box. Right? It was a bit of a, when you're trying to pander to who you think is your majority, rather than having a clear stance, I think has really cost it, right? Because I think one thing about Trump, like him or not, he's pretty clear what he stands for.
Absolutely.
Right? But when you become muddy, and then there was an interesting article that was in the Rolling Stones magazine, I think, that it was saying that the vote for Harris is not a vote to save the planet, it's a vote to save ourselves. And it was talking about how a lot of the policies under her watch has actually been quite pro-climate. But the point is, she has dared not speak about it because she's worried about her voter base. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about, I think there's a need for authenticity in leadership. Moral leadership is needed. And I wish we'd have a lot more president like was it Uruguay that had the president who left as the poorest president in the entire world?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm an optimist. I wish there were more people like that who's actually in there for the greater public cause, which I think the world is looking for. But it is what it is.
Yeah, we got Carola, I think from Europe. I think Austria or Germany. I'm sorry, I'll need to find out. I'm wondering if we're going to have geopolitical chaos. In you're looking at Europe and the way they're responding to it. The GDP for weapons is now 3%. David, I don't know if you saw that. He's increased it. So great for the US arms industry. So if you want to put some money in shares, I think that's obviously going to be a good spot. I suppose what I want to say is just how do you deal with this, the feelings of this? Because I know a lot of people I know are in absolute despair, and I want to talk about how I cope with it, because it's the only thing. I mean, I deal with hard, dark stuff every single day. Sometimes it gets to me. First of all is the fear of what is to come. If you sit in that, it cripples you. So it's really a really good time to be very present in the moment, very, very family oriented. David was talking about community. We've said before many times on the show, no one's coming to save us, because as all of this rolls out and in the climate and the disasters get bigger and worse, obviously there's going to be less and less money on the table anyway. So we're getting a sense of that. But try not to sit in fear of the future. Try and live in the moment. We're going to see some pretty hard stuff. It's going to be hard to cope with, watching families separated, and we're already starting to see it. Some neighbours dobbing in their mates in the US because they're illegal immigrants, and those illegal immigrants voted for Trump. So the despair is already going to start. So try and step back from the emotions if you can, even though it's very, very difficult, especially if you're an emotional person. But I find if I'm sitting in the emotions all the time, I just can't cope. So being very objective, like we know what's coming, we know what it means, we know that a lot of people are going to suffer. And the less intense you can be within the emotional sort of outreach of that, I think the better off you'll be. It's not easy, and you've got to allow yourself sometimes to go into it. I think a lot of people are in grief right now. In 2016, I went into despair well into February. I don't feel that same feeling. You know, we talked about acceptance as our first show of the season, and acceptance is you can see all the possible outcomes and you accept that any of them can happen, and then you still need to move forward, even though it might not be a particularly good outcome as far as you're concerned. So I think, you know, in the next 4 years, and it could be beyond, you know, based on what a lot of people are saying, this is not just a 4-year cycle. This is potentially America moving into full authoritarianism. I wonder if that's just the path we're going to be on now, because, you know, when times are hard, people are looking for strong men and strong women. I lost my train of thought. But yeah, it's not an easy time. Give yourself time to deal with the emotions, but just try not to stay there if you can. It's going to be hard. For the climate movement, it's incredibly difficult, but we've just got to come together. We've got to build our communities. We've got to cross divides. You know, Roger Hallam released a post this week. You know, I don't know if you're seeing his stuff. He's releasing it from prison. And his answer is we've got to get community focused, and we've got to, you know, bring small groups of people together and have the human to human experience, and talk about the issues and listen to each other and hear each other. And, you know, if the Democratic Party in the US is so elitist that they've completely missed the problems of the working class, then they need to work out how to cross the divide, and both ways, you know. And so we've got unbelievably challenging years ahead. I think people are going to experience the climate crisis under authoritarianism for the first time in the US, and they're going to see what that strongman solution is. And maybe that's enough to turn things around and bring us back on track. Maybe it's not. So
I'm a lot more optimistic than that. I have to say, you know, I think that change happens not because everything is going smoothly and everything's perfect. Change happens precisely out of you know, kind of the things which don't work. You know, the boundaries are what inspires us, and they either inspire us to try and climb over them, or they inspire us to find a way within them. And we've got so many different boundaries. Some of them are kind of nature-based, some of them are society and politics, and some of them are economic. And we're seeing all those boundaries on all sides. So it's actually quite inspiring in that way. If we actually, you know, the opposite of the acceptance is the denial. And what is that denial? The denial is always a denial that change is possible. And that's kind of the perspective, actually saying, are we willing to go past thinking that actually changes, and to think that change is actually possible? Most of the time, we want change to be something changing on the margin so that we can carry on ourselves as we are. And what you mentioned about the Democrats, I think is really interesting, because a strong part of what Trump says is we got to look after ourselves. And this is the part where Richard and I have always said, you know, you've got to look after yourself in order to survive, but you've got to look after each other to thrive. So it's that connection along with it. And there has been a lot of, we've got to look after each other, but if we forget that we also have to look after ourselves, then you get a rebellion against it. And we've gone from we've got to look after each other to solely we've got to look after ourselves. That's kind of very bipolar in that sense, and this is forcing us along and to meet somewhere. And as I've always said, nations are set up, countries are set up to fight wars with each other. That's how countries were formed. That's how nations were formed. You know, the kings were there to go and lead an army against your enemy, which is on the other side. My daughter was talking to me last night about the Great War of China. You know, it was set there to keep people out. That's what it was about. That's what countries do. But people are the ones that join. When you go traveling along and you see the different places, the people you meet, the people are the one that unites and connects, not countries. And we've been getting that wrong. Our whole economy is about how to keep and fight economic wars with each other. That's what the first salvo of Trump. Tariffs are going to go up. It's the people who recognize actually that we need to connect, otherwise we can't actually trade. And it's never going to come from countries, never going to come from governments, because their role is to fight wars.
Yeah, cannot add much more to that. I think it's incredibly important distinction David sets out, and we don't actually in our even democratic setup have those mechanisms in place, because those mechanisms were typically set up decades and centuries ago, and they're very much how to protect what is ours, not to look for any kind of global cooperation. And the institutions we have set up since that are global in nature, per definition, do not have much executive power. And that's where they kind of fail, because we ultimately have elected politicians into a system that are saying we're not going to cede any executive powers to supranational organs and institutions. So you have that dichotomy that's constantly going to be very, very difficult to reconcile if we think that's going to be the solution coming. I see it much more as you build from the base and up. It's the people that have to decide and make those individual choices for themselves. And then you form communities that are like-minded, groups that are like-minded, areas that think that way. And that is the path forward, because then you will automatically get the change we need. I cannot see it being superimposed top-down.
Yeah. Interesting. So Nico's just asked, I've seen many African countries celebrating Trump winning, and I was wondering if they will also pull out on climate change issues. I'm concerned about that. I want to hear your thoughts on the African. So, I mean, pulling out of climate change issues, it's not really like they can, because they're on the front line of climate change. So that's, yeah.
I mean,
any thoughts?
No, I think they will. If it's clear that the money isn't coming, the biggest finds in oil, you know, places like Namibia, they're about to start drilling in the Orange Basin. You know, it's going to be, you know, 48 out of 55 countries in Africa.
Yeah, they're exploring
actively exploring for oil and gas. In there, fair chunk of coal still there. They absolutely the issue is why are the trillions being called for, is because it is felt that development has to start with money.
So it's kind of ironic, isn't it? We're going to drill for oil in Africa to get the money.
Waste that money either by exploiting the minerals underground, or we get it from, and that's what's going to happen.
So David, you're just breaking up a bit. You're just breaking up a bit.
Sorry,
that's why I spoke over you before.
I think he's back now.
But it actually sounds like the ultimate irony, don't you think?
Yeah, of course it is. Absolutely, 100% the ultimate irony.
And I'd like to, you know, throw something in there. I mean, there is a way that you can actually make money from the oil and gas and coal in the ground by keeping them in the ground. So, you know, you can go to an impact investor and says to who wants to invest in, say, you know, Namibia or somewhere where they are about to drill huge amounts, and sort of say, well, you have a vast basin there, you know, there are reserves in there. So let's just think about me giving making an investment to some project in the country, which may be a sustainable project or whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter what it is. And I'm going to partner with the government. The government's the owner of this. So I'm going to buy that stuff while it's still in the ground so that you eventually won't take it out. And that money goes through the government into the project as a joint partner or whatever it is. Whereas at the moment, what's done is we partner with the government still takes that out eventually. So there are ways that you can actually make money from keeping them in the ground.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think we've got a bit of a problem with your connection there. So should we move on to our topic for today?
Indeed.
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to show a picture, if I may. Let's see whether I can do that. The screen. I think I'm just going to try and share the screen and see what happens there. And I am looking for window, that one. Can you guys see this?
No, nothing showing at the moment.
Here you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a snapshot I took yesterday, and it shows basically the air quality. And I'd really like to point out back to what we were talking about. It's green over there in the US. It's relatively green over in Europe, and you can see where it's spread to across the world. And this is the air we breathe. This is the air quality index across the world as a snapshot yesterday afternoon. And it's pretty much that way all around. I thought that would be a good sort of introduction to the topic of saying what this is. And I want to bring up one part of this because I wrote a LinkedIn post last night because I was walking to pick up my daughter at night. And it was, the traffic had slowed down. It was late at night and it was dark. And, I took a deep breath and I felt like energized. I could walk a bit faster and picked up straight away. I was out earlier in the day. It was busy traffic and I just felt I was breathing shallower and shallower. And my body was just naturally reacting to that and I was feeling bad. And this is the air the most important thing we do every day, the air we breathe. And it affects your mood, it affects how you are. And I like to think of it from the side of saying, I just felt so much more alert and awake when I could take a deep breath. And there's all the things that it causes when you can't do that. You can imagine them yourself. But actually, it's great if you can go out and take deep breaths. It's great if you can train for the Paris Marathon and do those things. So that's kind of a throw into it. And the other comment is how complex this issue is all related to where is green, where it's not. Where what has happened is that, and this goes to our sense of regulations and things, essentially. Europe has great clean air regulation. America has great clean air regulation. What that means is their industries sit on one side of the fence and they throw the other side to the places which don't, and actually then say, you guys breathe that stuff, but just let us consume what you make. And that whole throw and the picture just says that completely. So I want to put that there.
It's actually a terrifying simplistic model. It allows you to look good because effectively the industrialized world has exported all the shittiest industries to other places, and all of a sudden we look good here, but we're still consuming the stuff that's been manufactured elsewhere. You couldn't make it up. But then to have the audacity to say, look, we are doing better, and beat yourself up on the chest and say, it's your problem. It's really, really not very intellectually, likable as an argument. It's terrifying in many ways. So there we are. It's great to have you here, Weena. And I think we can start with Thailand Clean Air Network. What
Yep.
was your thought process and the reason when you decided to start it?
Yeah, thank you. So I think you guys hit on the key points just now, the discussion about change happening at a citizen level, an individual level, and also the inequality, particularly at a global level and with the supply chain. So with the Thailand Clean Air Network, we started off, we have experts in different fields. We knew this was difficult. We knew it needed expertise from people from different industries, know-how. It's not just one person, it's not just one small group. And we knew that was what's needed to solve this problem. We knew we couldn't leave it to the good old politicians to try to really solve this problem for us. Pushing for something like clean air legislation is not easy. It's, David, you said, it's wonderful to take a deep breath and to appreciate it. Most of the time we don't know because we don't see it. It's invisible to the human eye. And therefore, people have said, if we turn on the tap and the water is disgusting, it's smelly, no one's going to drink that. And everyone's going to be up in arms. But because a lot of times you're not aware of how bad the air quality is, it's a long kill. In some cases, it's not long actually, but unfortunately, but yeah, when you breathe, it's a bit of a gamble as to where it goes, right? Particulate matter 2.5 is so small; it's 1/130th of the width of human hair. You can't see it. The hair in your nose cannot trap it. It may go straight in, and doctors would tell you it actually absorbs straight into your bloodstream. And then where it accumulates, it's a bit of a luck of the draw. It goes to the brain, it goes to the heart, it goes to the lungs, and it's linked to everything from, as the doctors have said, from your brain to your toes, from dementia, bipolar disease. It's been linked to obviously respiratory illnesses, lung cancer, also cardiac vascular issues. It stunts growth in children. It's been documented that children's level of education has been reduced by a year because of this. And the most vulnerable groups are, your young children, 5 years and younger, and also most youth because their organs are not developed, with pregnant women, people who are elderly because their body are weaker, people who work out in the elements. So here in Thailand, your street workers, your people selling stuff, your riders who have to be out. It's not just the level, but it's also how long you've been out, the intensity. So these are vulnerable groups that we also so what we did was we brought collectively our knowledge and we adopted the EU consultative process in passing legislation. So we want a legislation that's developed based on information, knowledge, data, not on emotions and feelings, not on project, so what we did was we developed, so using the same process, because my lawyers have said, the EU process is quite airtight. So we developed the white paper, which goes into relatively airtight, into the overall picture of the problem of air quality in Thailand. Then we developed the blue paper, Clean Air Blue Paper, which goes into the impact of air quality in Thailand. And the final paper, which is the green paper, it's the solution space paper. That one's over 700 pages. Because it touches on all the sectors, it gets into, so we touch upon the impact from the agricultural sector, forest fire, and transboundary. So that's one group that we touch upon. The second group is vehicle pollution as well as urbanization. Those are intertwined and quite interlinked. And then the third group is the industrial group. So it's your extractive industry, it's your industrial factories, it's your waste management, it's your energy sector. Yeah. So those are sort of the core group. And then we also have sections related to the key stakeholders, and we lump them into the state. So the role and responsibility of the state to manage solutions to this. We also have civil society. Civil society is all of us who take off our hats. What are, as an individual level, what is our role and responsibility? What is as we are victims, but there are also things that we can do to help push the clean air agenda forward. And then the last group is the private sector and also the financial sector. The financial sector, a lot of people don't think about. It's not part of the real sector, but where money goes in the world today does impact a lot. Right. So what's the role and responsibility of the financial sector in resolving this? Each chapter is really, we bring in expertise from different areas, and it's not just a normal paper, because what we have in each chapter is a solution from an economic standpoint, a solution from a legal standpoint, and a solution from civil society. in each chapter, and then we synthesize, bring it all together, and have final conclusion as to what are the solutions that we table, and it's quite hefty. And that is the premise of the citizen-led clean air legislation. So we drafted the legislation and submitted into Parliament. I have to go back a little bit to preface the entire constitution. There is an avenue for citizens to table legislation, so long as you get above 10,000 signatories. And we did all this throughout COVID, which was not fun. And in Thailand, when we were doing it at that time, you had to do it manually. So you had to bring a piece of paper, a form, physically go up to someone, and they don't want to even be near you, and then say, please sign this and give me a copy of a national ID. And yes, that is a personal security risk, but please trust me. I don't know who, you don't know me, I don't know you.
Wow.
So it was really hard. So we did all that. But fortunately, towards the end of when we were collecting signatures, they did change the law and we were able to do it online as well. And that really helped us. But when it came to actually going to Parliament, they told me, you got to print all, we got at the end about 22,000 signatures. So I had to kill a lot of trees to bring that to Parliament. And that was around 2022, early 2022. And we sat there and nobody did anything. And then every few months, we're like nudging the government, sending formal letters saying, hey, people, this is important. What's happening? And nothing was happening. And it was just kind of quiet. But in the backdrop, there was also, but one of the things that did happen before we tabled was that the Chamber of Commerce had also drafted a legislation as well, using the same avenue. And if you're optimistic, it's like, oh, it's great. You know, everybody's coming together to try to solve this problem. I categorize myself a little as a realist, because I say it's all great, but let's look at the details, right? When you look into the details, we're just like, oh, it's rather pro-polluter. And so that was what we were working up against for a lot of the time. And ultimately, what had happened was that after 2 years, the cabinet did draft legislation. We were advised. Some of our members were part of the advisory team to try and advise. We literally say, just take ours, but they didn't. So there's a cabinet version and other political parties tabled too. So at the end, there are 7 legislation. We're the only citizen-led legislation. Others do have a lot of nuance that appears to have been visioned by big businesses themselves. It's the way things are. So since early this year, all 7 drafts went to the House of Representatives, and they took a vote on it. And a decision was taken to pass all 7 into the next level. And that's where we've been doing since January. We've been going to Parliament for formal review, drafting committees for 10, getting on to 11 months now. And it's getting more intense. There's lots of subcommittee levels. And particularly my legal team, it's been extremely, extremely difficult and very, very grilling. But we're doing all this because, as you say, this is the air we breathe. And we do need good legislation.
Yeah.
So I want to take it back about how has it become so bad. So I moved to Asia in 2003, and I'd been through Singapore before during the haze. So the sun's like this orb in the sky. So it was an issue in the 90s. It's been an issue for a while. And in 2003, I remember just saying to Singaporeans, "What's causing this?" And people would say to me, "Oh, I don't know. It just happens every year." I'm like, "You don't know? How do you not know?" And so then, of course, I started looking into it. And, of course, the internet wasn't what it is now back then. And then in 2006, when I was about to give birth to my first child, the haze just started to come in. And I mean, it puts you in a bit of a panic, right? The Singapore government's done a lot. And I know that they've worked with the Malaysian and the Indonesian government about the transboundary haze, because it comes from Indonesia, where they're chopping down the forest to plant palm oil plantations, which is awful. But the Singapore government has done a lot, because it got up to about, I remember when I was at Microsoft, it was up at about 800, and you couldn't even see the skyscraper next to you. It was so bad, right? So when you said you can't see it, you can see it when it gets that bad, right? And then when I moved to Phuket 7 years ago, we had a haze experience, and that was coming from Indonesia. But then, of course, we went up north into Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai, where every year there's this haze. And I was asking locals and farmers, why is it happening? And one of the reasons I was told is because of there's more wealth in the country, the farmers are growing more food and they have to turn their fields over faster, so they're burning more. But when I spoke to you, there seems to be a little bit more to it than that. So how has it gotten so bad? Because it's been about 15 years where it's just gotten worse and worse and worse, right? And so we're now at this sort of critical point. So can you give us some of the context of how it's gotten so bad beyond transboundary?
Right. If you're talking specifically on the agro industry part of it, and I use the word industry because it is an industry, it is very much linked to three major crops in Thailand. For Thailand, it's maize, it's sugarcane, and it's rice. So those are the three corporate crops linked to burning. A lot, particularly sugarcane and maize. A lot of it is on linked to contract farming. So a lot of the small-scale farmers are, through middlemen, growing to feed into a big agro-industry and the huge need, right? And it's growing so big. Now, it's also linked to sort of inequality issues, because if you look into household debts in Thailand, the farmers are actually one of the highest indebted group in the country.
Wow.
Yeah, right. So they're very they do. There's a big indebtedness issue, and so it begs the question, like, if you're a farmer stuck in a contract farming arrangement where you've got to deliver, so a sugarcane farmer has to supply their sugarcane within a very short window, the harvesting period, to send to the sugar mill. It's like 8 might be a stretch, 6 to 8 weeks. It's very intense. That's how the industry is. And that's the only time they take it in. So if you don't get it in, you're not going to get paid, right?
Yeah.
And with the sugar fields, I mean, and we are an aging society in Thailand. So when you say, why are you doing it with manual labor? Well, where do you find the manual labor? It's a really practical issue, right? And then when you say, oh, why don't you use a harvester? Well, harvester is 5 to 6 million baht. If it's secondhand, it's about 12 million baht. And how do you, as a highly indebted farmer, acquire that, right? It doesn't make any sense. And to use it for a period of about 6 to 8 weeks is ridiculous, right? So the cheapest option, I mean, very, very practically, is a matchstick. And especially with sugarcane, they burn it twice a year. Twice in a season. So they burn to get the leaves off because it's easier to get in, and then chop. And then they'll burn it again to get rid of the biomass, right? And then they'll quickly ship it in. And I've heard cases where when they put it on the truck and get it in, it's crazy. It's crazy amount, because truck drivers have to sometimes sleep overnight in trucks waiting in front of the mills to get it in. And the penalty for burnt sugar, I still think it's like only 30 baht per tonnage. And you're getting paid over 1,000, 1,200 baht per tonnage. So it's not enough to disincentivize that behavior. And then, the bigger question, well, who should in the entire ecosystem help to solve this problem? And that's where, things are missing. There's nobody taking that broader view of coming in, because there should be leasing options out there. There should be solutions that way. And that's one of the key things that we're trying to do. So in this legislation, which is, it has penalties, but it's with environmental legislation, we're actually pushing in a lot of economic incentives. So we are bringing in polluter pay, but using it to fund a Clean Air for Health fund. And that money is used for many, many things. One of it is to help incentivize SMEs and companies that are trying to develop this leasing operation for harvester, for example, to be part of the solution. But it's also helping with environmental justice issue, helping with cases of victims and all of that as well. So, we're trying to close the loop and trying to put responsibility back to the party that should have it. So going back to your question, it is linked to the agro industry, the huge demand now for food. So Thailand, for example, corn is used for animal feed. And we're the world's biggest producer of animal feed. Right? Sugar.
Did not know that.
Yeah, we are. We're the world's biggest producer of animal feed. Sugar, we're always within the top 10, probably the top 5 in the world. And then rice, we're always within the top 10. So these agro crops, these agro industry crops, which is linked to the agro industry. Then when I knew that I've heard that and also the production is moved outside. So when we talk about transboundary, it's an easy thing for governments to say, because it's like, oh, it's beyond our territory, we can't do anything. but there's enough evidence to show a lot of the transboundary coming in is linked to Thai businesses, whether it's agricultural businesses or even a coal-fired power plants and industries as well, that are doing operations quite close to the border, and so the pollution blows in. So it's all of that, yeah. And
but it's not. It's obviously not just agribusiness, right? So we've got Sushil joining us from Mumbai. So obviously vehicle pollution. But what else? What are the other big issues?
So the big sources are, you've got your agro industry, which is also linked to forest fire issues and transboundary issues. You've got your vehicle pollutions. Here in Bangkok, obviously too many cars. The way the city is built up. I mean, right now, if you live in Bangkok, they're building up the city like it's Hong Kong or Tokyo or Manhattan, which is absolutely crazy because you're not taking into account the way the wind flows and you're blocking it. And it does not make any sense because we are right at the Gulf of Thailand. We have natural wind flows, but it's not actually helping us because of the way the city's been built up. It used to be a lot more responsible in time past with previous city governors where they've not allowed for super tall buildings to be right next up to each other, right? And also the ongoing construction all the time, it's causing a traffic jam, and and then of course even construction causes PM10, which is absolutely terrible for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And then you also have the industrial sector. So in Thailand, there's over 100,000 or odd factories around the world in Thailand, and around 40,000 odd or so surrounds Bangkok. Right. So so Mata Phut, which is in Thailand's eastern seaboard, that has been a pollution hotbed since the late 80s. It's huge. I mean, you can Google it up and it's so much problem. It's the world's 8th largest petrochemical hub. Yeah. So, and we don't talk too much about industrial pollution for one very simple reason. The data's not there. We don't have emissions inventory data. So it's really, really hard to say. So we actually don't even allocate the percentage of because when we don't have that data to really have confidence, we can say roughly, we can have a gauge, but we don't have specific allocation percentages.
Yeah.
But the sad part is in this region, we're all next to each other, and what we do affects each other. And I think that's what's happened in Singapore, where you are, Andrea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honestly, if you've never experienced a haze environment for a long period of time, it's just the worst. And the recent floods in Bangkok, so the air's not flowing through the city right in the way it should, but the water's not flowing through either, so it's a double problem. And of course rising sea levels are at risk, and they're talking about putting these islands in the Gulf to protect it from flooding. And I don't know, it's challenging, but life expectancy in Thailand, especially in the parts up north, is down by 2 years. Is that right?
Oh, more than that. It's almost 3 to 4 years, depending.
Okay. I was looking at, in Delhi, 10 years in New Delhi, right? Lahore is, and then the Himalayas sort of keep the smoke in. Lahore is like what it's going through at the moment. We're just and we don't it seems to just be getting worse and worse. We're not solving any of it. It's very frustrating. No, it is. But I think there is hope because as David and Richard has talked about, the power of citizens. If you go back and look into history, and the passage of the U.S. clean air legislation, which really galvanized environmental legislation in the U.S., was actually driven by people. We had 20 million people walking the streets. I mean, really walking along pavements, pushing, the Love Canal issues that happen up in somewhere up in upstate New York. These different people just saying enough. They're not going to take this. So it sounded like, oh yeah, the U.S. is just going to do it because it's the U.S. No. It took people pushing it. And then when you look, right? And then when you look into China, people are like, it's got a strong government. Chinese government would do what it takes. Well, no. My friends who lived in Beijing during that period were telling me that people got together every week in Beijing, just trying to figure out what can they do to push the clean air agenda forward. I mean, it was not just willy-nilly anybody. And there were a lot of NGOs pushing it. I've collaborated with somebody there who's really critical in part of that. There was a lady who was a newscaster in China, and when she was carrying her baby, the doctor thought her baby had a risk of a tumor,
And she was shocked because she didn't know how that could have been, and that ignited her to actually go, because previously she was working in a lot of the lower tier cities, where big industrial cities. And so she wondered if it was the air that she was breathing in. And she took the time to actually do this huge documentary called Under the Dome. And that ignited a lot of people. So we're different individuals doing their thing. But I think that really pushed the momentum until, like 2012, 2013, where the Chinese government were like, just said, okay, it's a war on pollution. And actually in China, it's not that easy because, your industrial polluters are actually state-owned.
Yeah.
Right? Like, right. But I think what was really good is just the way that it was managed, because I think at some level there was a sense of that we need to pull together to solve this. And so one of the developments that came from is an application called the Blue Map app, which is incredible. If you've ever seen that, you can Google it up on. There's a TED Talk by Ma Jun, who was a founder and developed this, and that's phenomenal because what he did was he actually pulled data that the government released on industrial pollution. And it was hard for individuals to actually make sense of it and develop into an app. And you actually look and he color codes it, and you are able to see what factory is closest to your house, and it'll give you all the data. What are they polluting? When have they been in violation? What's happened? And apparently it gives you a chat feature. So what happened was people organically went in, and they were like actually tagging government agencies that are responsible for managing air pollution, to the point where it got to the point where, before they could have kind of turned a blind eye and kind of sign off on factories that weren't meeting limits. It ended up being part of the KPI. When enough people were part of the watchdog and putting them. And so what he did was he brought in micro-reporting from citizens. He brought in transparency in all of this. And actually from a government standpoint, that's beautiful, because it's their backstop to go out to the polluting entities and say, hey, we can't put a blind eye on this anymore. We can't use our hands to close the sky anymore, because it's very transparent. So I think there are means and ways of doing it. And also I've spoken to a lot of advocates in Indonesia, and they went down the judicial path, and that was incredible. They sued the government. They went all the way to the highest court. The government appealed, and they still won. And it was actually, like you said, David and Richard, it was connecting, and Andrea was connecting at a human to human level.
Yes.
When I spoke to them, they said, well, they looked at, they brought in cases, somebody with a young child, somebody with an aging parent, and brought these cases in. And at some level, I think when it went to court, the judges were listening to this, actually took off their hat and said, oh my God, I do have a young child in my house. I do have an aging parent. And somehow it's incredible, but they were able to connect at that human level, and that was successful. So I think what I'm saying is these things can happen if we collectively move together. And in Thailand, it's the same. I was telling you the PM 2.5 wasn't included in the air quality index. Data's been there, but it's not disclosed. But when people started falling sick around 2018-19, they complained a lot through social media. And that complaining en masse towards the same issue caused the government officials to release that data within 9 months.
Yeah.
They pulled their leg for 10 years, they wouldn't do it. So there are means and ways of pushing for change. I just think that we need to be more active citizens. I believe, coming out of what's happened in the US, I do believe as a citizen, it's not our role. It's not just once every 4 years in the ballot box.
No.
Yeah.
No,
Totally.
no. Yeah, if you think you have the right to be heard, which is kind of a fundamental democratic right, you also have a responsibility. And it's the second part people tend to forget.
Yeah.
That actually with that right comes attached a responsibility to make your views heard and pushing in the right direction, because otherwise you become kind of complicit in not making a change for the better. So with the right is always the responsibility. And what you're describing in China, I think, is extremely interesting, because totalitarian, authoritarian society can push back a lot against a few people expressing views, and that's kind of how it's operated in history. But once that minority, or whatever we want to call them, group is large enough, then it becomes a much bigger problem than it does in a democratic society when you can still marginalize them through the vote. You cannot do that in China because ultimately social cohesion is the ultimate target
Yeah.
for whoever is running China. And therefore, you can go very quickly in moving ahead by saying this is enough of a big problem that we need to actually attack it and deal with it. And you can do it much, much quicker than you do in a traditional democratic society, which is kind of interesting. Also to the point when we're debating authoritarianism at large, but you can actually move very swiftly.
Yeah. You should keep an eye on what China's doing to clean up its environment, not
Yes.
just its air, but its water. It's really moving fast.
I think that's super interesting, Andrea, and I encourage everyone to kind of keep tabs on what actually is happening in China, because it will have huge repercussions for the whole region, including Thailand.
I think one of the last things Richard and I did, where we were still very active within the investment industry, we looked at environmental patents. And China outnumbers the US, Europe, and other countries in total. China alone outnumbers all of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should get on to the next one about the challenges that you faced along the journey.
Yeah.
Nina?
Yeah.
I know it's not easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy. Ultimately, I think it's a mindset issue. So it goes back, it's cultural mindset. So we look at a problem like, like the, what's under the iceberg, right? So people say, air pollution and all this. But I think ultimately, what makes it tough is trying to explain to Thais about your right to clean air. And it's actually a right to life, right? And we're pushing up against some sort of cultural belief that, Thais are very conformist, I would say, by culturally more conformist, more groupthink, more going with the flow, more taking things easy. And so, it's really hard to tell people who believe that and say, be an active citizen. Because it kind of goes against the grain of how they've been brought up, right? So that's been challenging. I think that the belief of, and then this sort of, just going back to what you were saying, sort of this belief that there is a holier than thou leadership that's going to do the best and everything for us, and we voted him or her in, and that's it. We'll close our eyes and let him or her do their thing, right? And so this belief that, someone's in charge and they'll know what they're doing and they'll do everything for us and we don't have to do anything. So that's been challenging. And just trying to get people to say, there's nothing, we've always been trying to communicate out to the big businesses. I come from the private sector too, and trying to say, hey guys, this is a problem. Let's work together to find solutions. And what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, especially for the big guys, you guys have all the skills and abilities to do things. You move much faster than governments, obviously, right? We've had discussions with some of the big players, and it's like, we've got supply chain traceability. It's not ours. It's like, fantastic, you have it. Make it transparent. Make it publicly available. Then show it that it's not yours, right? And that's where, you see them pushing back and you're like, proprietary. I said, no. Going forward, you are going to have to be responsible for your supply chain. Legislation coming out of Europe and the US is very clear. For you to be relevant in your high value markets, you've got to have these things in place. So what we're doing with this legislation is actually pushing you along this way, right? And saying, look, these are things that you need to do. And for companies, we know it's not cheap. We know green technology is not cheap. We know it's not easy. But for those who qualify for support, you can actually get support through the Clean Air for Health Fund to transition your operation, right? But it's conditional and you've got to qualify, right? So it's not a finger pointing, you're the polluter, you're bad, and you've got to solve all this. No, it's like, this is a problem, all of us being affected. Let's figure out a way of just an equitable way to transition. And you big guys, you have all the data, right? Disclose it. And I think with Transboundary Haze, the way we've done it is we've said, look, the big issue, it's always been this big argument of it's not ours, right? It's someone else's. And like, okay, let's do this then. We are in the 21st century. There is satellite data, there's ground data, and there's meteorological data. Those are the key elements you need to figure out the location of where a lot of these operations are happening, and it's blowing pollution into Thailand. It's causing massive health impact. Okay, a lot of you guys have supply traceability, so you say, okay, fine. You prove it's not yours. You prove it's not yours. Until you don't, until you can prove it's not yours, you'll be slapped with a fine that's on par with the Singapore Transboundary Haze Act.
Yeah.
Because that's the way we can lift the barrier to be on the same plane. And if every single country, and it's such an incredible thing that my legal team pulled together, but if we all do the same thing here in Asia, we will be able to solve this problem, right? The ASEAN Transboundary Haze Act, I think I don't remember the years now. It took the 10th country to sign, I think took over a decade. And I was just on a con call just yesterday, actually, and Indonesia was showing the actual space that they've prepared for the, there's a ASEAN Transboundary Haze Coordination Center that's been set up, which is fantastic. It's been set up. But what they've showed us is there's tables and chairs ready, and it looks like a swanky office, but they've said, we've got no equipment, we've got no money to hire people. So, and I empathize with them, right? Because it's a regional issue. And they keep saying, we don't have the funding, and, but every single day that we don't solve this, more people are dying. That's the bottom line. And ASEAN is, and a lot of people say, let's rely on ASEAN. ASEAN is a different setup than the EU and the EMU, right? So we've got to figure out ways of doing this. So that's kind of how we're hoping to be able to move this agenda forward. And actually, ultimately, it has to be an ASEAN approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say there was also a piece in Eco Business that was talking about coal. Obviously, coal is still big in this part of the world, and it's growing. It's one of the only parts of the world that's still investing, not just ASEAN, but Asia across the board. So, and coal is obviously a big issue when it comes to the 2.5 particulates. So that's another challenge. The energy infrastructure that's being built, it's not being built for a healthy future problem.
Yeah, for sure.
No,
for sure. Yeah.
I would assume that coal is the major polluter in all these, because compared to regular traffic and other things, it has a lot of super negative properties that even with modern techniques, you can't really hide from, because coal is coal, and
But
it's a nasty source of energy, full stop.
I think I like the description of how it brings the incentives together in what you're describing. These things takes time. So China took a long time. The Under the Dome video, which I remember seeing when it came out, that was a shocker, because it directly attacked the government, really explicitly, the local government, central government, and all of those things there. So everybody was wondering, how on earth did this woman getting away with this? And in part, I think because people saw it and recognized what it is. So there's that connection part, which is very important. I think there's another connection part which is also important, which is the pace of nature. When you describe about the rush to get the agricultural product into the mill and so on, we're imposing a pace which is not the pace of agriculture in nature. And that's always going to end up becoming an issue in all of these things. The push into coal again, if you look at Bangladesh, which is increasing its coal power, is because it needs to produce garments 24/7 for the rest of the world in that way. And that again is a pace that is not the pace at which we normally need clothes, the pace of our own nature in that sense. And I think that's a connect which we don't bring out enough. we tend to think of the problem as the scientific or technological aspect, or the particular point of the problem. We don't go back and say, actually, what is the pace that helps us to thrive? And what does that imply about all the demands we have on everything else? How do we ourselves want to live at the pace? There's this idea of the veil of ignorance. This was a concept introduced by a moral philosopher called John Rawls, who says, when you go about doing something, imagine you don't know which side you're on. You're under this veil of ignorance. What would you choose in that case? And it's always going to be different when you open up that veil and you see yourself as being, I'm on the consumer side, or I'm on the producer side, or wherever it is. But when you actually try to do it with a veil of ignorance on top of it, you end up making very different choices.
Yeah, inevitably so. And the whole thing that David is articulating is extremely close to my heart, as financial guy and economist and all that. One of my biggest bugbears that has always stuck with me ever since school, effectively, is how we account for growth. And we leave aside the fact that there is some form of natural equilibrium level of growth. Of course, things grow, and that's my issue with kind of the degrowth movement. It's very negative. The planet grows, but when you impose and you kind of force it to go at a different pace, there is a price to pay. And for us, that's typically debt. If I run up debt and I consume it, it counts as growth, but no one is ever accounting for the payback of that debt. And to me, it's an anomaly in how we account for economic progress. And it's pretty clear, just looking at the world now, that we are probably coming towards the end of some form of super cycle for debt. Because unless we get rates down to zero, these debt repayments will not actually work out for the people in debt, whether it's government, corporations, or individuals, because you cannot grow at that rate from here that enables you to pay back these debts. And I think it's a major fault and also a major cause in how we structure businesses to extract at the rate which is not compatible with long-term prosperity.
I think it's, what Rino was mentioning before about the farmers and their debt.
Yeah.
The payback of the debt is the pollution that you see.
Yes.
That's the payback. People think it's not the interest rate. That's the
No.
payback. And that occurs everywhere. But the point is, when interest rates go low, we take on more financial debt. So we always take the debt to the level of what we can financially pay back. And that leaves a bigger scar on everything else as we do so. It's really interesting. I think that, it'd be really interesting to have something on, the payback of debt or whatever it is as a topic at some point.
Yeah.
It is so much on this, but on the positives, on the opposite side of this, I think this aspect of connecting with the pace of nature is something that I feel very, very much as a way of trying to talk about, in the sense, especially when you start talking to the bigger economic picture, because nature grows, but it doesn't expect growth. And that expectation of growth is where you try to put a number of it. As soon as you start thinking about, well, how much do I expect when I grow? You start trying to put a number on it. You actually reduce the total overall growth you have over time, because once you put a number on it, you force it and you have to borrow, and then there's more debt, and that cascades on in that way. And again, this goes to change of mind. That sort of belief that things can change. We can actually have a growing and prosperous economy, and people can thrive as one that doesn't have to be dependent on having money first, having debt to start us there. I think the clean air brings out many of these aspects.
Absolutely. It makes the point I think we're all kind of agreeing on, but articulating somewhat differently. It brings it all together in what we are doing to this planet, and how it is certainly not sustainable, and how we go about fixing this, because we
So I
have
think-
to.
Sorry, so there's a word that we use in economics, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, which is externality, right? So we take the environment completely out, society completely out of our calculation, right?
Yeah.
It's a free resource, right?
Yes.
And if you think of something free, you think it's abundant, you can use it all the time, it costs you nothing, so you don't value it. And I think that's a big problem. And then if you want to, I'm really, really passionate about intergenerational equity, right? So what kind of world are we leaving, right? Have we used so much resources that the next generation cannot survive in a decent environment anymore, and the generation after that, right? Which is, I think there was a push for governments at one stage, I don't know where it's gone, but I think at one point I knew that the leadership of New Zealand, Scotland, and I think Iceland were pushing for this. And that was to bring in intergenerational equity discussions. So whenever projects are being tabled to the government, the minister has to answer that question. Like if you extract something from the ground, like if it's coal or oil, how do you then explain that impact of that resource, which once it's gone, and all the ramification of extracting it out to the next generation. I think that picture is missing. And I think going back specifically to the clean air thing, which I think goes back to what David had kindly shown, which is the map of the air quality map for around the world. And that was something that struck us very, very big too when we saw that, because it was very clear that it was a global north, global south issue, not in my backyard kind of thing, where you just move the factory somewhere else and I have clean air. But I think the thing that also shocked me too was that I remembered, do you remember the CFC issues with the ozone and people coming together to solve it? And that was beautiful. It was a moment where countries came together. But when it comes to air pollution, it kind of feels like the global south has been kind of left on our own to solve this. And I look at funds that support, countries in this transition, because most of the factories are here. Most of the agricultural plains are here. The coal, the whatever you're digging, they're all here, right? So in this part of the world. But, amongst climate finance money, only 1% goes specifically to deal with clean air. And I think part of it may be because the global north has dealt with it, right? They've already dealt with air pollution. So they're focusing only on climate. But there's mutual benefits to solving both. They're not the same, obviously, but short-term air pollutants is responsible for half of global climate effects, right? And honestly, the air that you breathe, it affects all of us. So I remember my air pollution scientist had told me that she had worked quite a fair bit with some of the Chinese counterparts, and China being China, when they were looking and also counterparts out in LA, because obviously Los Angeles has been looking at this problem for a long time, and they were doing source apportionment, and there was a component they couldn't attribute to where it came from, and when they did the scientific analysis, they found out the portion they couldn't attribute to comes from China. I mean, these things go across boundaries, so it's stratosphere. We live under the same stratosphere, and it's a bit sad, I think, when it comes to the air pollution movement. There isn't that farm to table responsibility, whether it's the agriculture, whether it's industry aspect of it. There is no accountability from that angle. And one thing I know you live in Singapore right now, Andrea, you're saying that. Yeah, I was in Singapore a few weeks ago, and I don't know, I was kicking myself now. I went to a museum, and oh my God, I turned around and the person who was behind me was Ray Dalio. And I was like, oh my God, it's Ray Dalio. And I was like, I didn't know what to do. So I did the dorky thing, right? I just kind of went up to him and was like, could I take a photo? So I just took one quick photo, and then he kind of left. And I thought, oh gosh, I should have told him. I should have I know you've got a philanthropy. I know you're in Singapore probably to talk to Temasek and all this. And I know you care about the oceans, but could you also devote some of your interest towards air? Because it's such an important, critical issue. And I missed that. I should have just mentioned that to him. Yeah. But I also think that, I mean, if the global community came together and focused on this, it is a double whammy effect that we could address both air quality and climate change at the same time.
Yeah,
I think there's another aspect to cleaning up the air too quickly. So I don't know if you know this. So it was about 30 years later, they worked out that Europe cleaning up its air caused the famine in Ethiopia. When China cleaned up its air, it impacted the Pacific. So when India cleans up its air, because it's such a big, actually, as we clean up our air, we're going to see climate impacts because there's less particulates to reflect the heat out. So it's actually also, we can't just clean up the air. We've also got to do the other side, which is the really mass regeneration. Did you notice in Singapore how everywhere you go, they're planting trees? Everywhere. There's plants and new plants and old plants. Every piece of grass. If I see a piece of grass that doesn't have trees on it, I'm shocked. You know, it's like the goal is to plant trees, and they're doing it. If you come, I need to drive around and film it because it's really quite amazing, the change. And it's always been green, but it's they're working very hard to make it greener, which of course is also a good thing to clean up the air pollution, right?
Yeah. It does help.
There's a couple of things you're talking about in terms of that. I keep wanting to use the different word to externalities because the word itself says ignore it. So I'd like to think of a different word to it in that sense. And I've had various things, but leaving that aside, you mentioned about the future generations and things, and Peter Birch has commented about this aspect about intercollutors that we don't know or like, which is kind of a future in some ways in that way. And there is this part which we talked a bit about with Richard and I when we were writing our book, The Unsustainable Truth, of how a place in Japan had it's a small place, tiny little village, had this meeting about what do they do with planning. And they invited a generation from 50 years forward. So they got this generation, they trained these people to be a generation from 50 years forward. And it took a lot of training to think that you're not speaking from now, because one of the things that happens is we see our problems as our problems immediate. So we think about the bins that are not emptied in time, or the air pollution we have and all the rest of it. We don't see what a genuine future generation might see and come back and as a feedback. So, and it's really relevant because they said when they finally got the people to think about it as seeing it from the future, they came along and they said things like, it's so great that they gave us the mountains as a view for us to keep. Those things come out when you don't see yourself as saying, how do I plan my building so that it's sustainable? Because then you're led down the route of saying, well, I'm still building the building, but I'm just building it sustainably. And it goes back again to this aspect of you can't think of the externality from thinking about what the problem I have and how do I try to avoid externality. You have to think of it as saying, actually, what would nature look like? Because are we a part of nature, or do we feel ourselves as being shepherds of nature? And that's a huge difference. Because the way we think economically in terms of externalities is we have to be shepherds of nature. Because somehow if we did this, then we fix that and we protect it. As opposed to we are actually a part of it. How do we allow that to guide us of what we do instead of what do we have nature do for us?
I'm just sort of conscious of the time. Of course, we've gone long.
We've taken a lot of your time.
Yeah, and we really appreciate it, Wendy. So
listening. It's really fascinating. One
exactly.
last thing I want to add, which is I once spoke with a lobbyist who said, look, I was working all night, day and night on this thing. I lobbied against it. I thought it was great. And then I found out what damage it caused. And I'm never going to touch that industry again. And it made me think, actually, how much do we actually talk to lobbyists for them to actually appreciate what lobbying should mean? Sorry.
I was in PR for a long time. I worked with lots of lobbyists. Not all of them were thinkers. They might have been good. They might have been good at what they did, but they weren't all thinkers. Anyway, we know one of the things that really impressed me about what you've done, and I think I'm always seeking people like you in my life because you inspire me. Is I see a lot of people who live with problems that are so obvious. I can't see past them, like the rubbish on the beach in Phuket. I can't not see it. Whereas I'd see hundreds, thousands of tourists come through, as well as locals sitting on the beach in the rubbish and not pick it up. And I'm like, can't you see it? The pollution, those smoggy days in Bangkok are revolting. You can see it. And people just don't think that they can do anything about, what's going on. And I think we can. I think every one of us. So leave us with some inspiration for people out there who've seen a problem, something they love, something they care about. It's falling apart. It's degrading. I think of the people who are trying to save the coral reefs at the moment, how hopeless that must be feeling. But what's your advice to people who feel helpless and hopeless, especially at this time, especially this week? What would you tell them?
I think I believe we all have a role to play. And just I'm inspired because I'm lucky. It's a real team effort, and my team has been incredible. I can't even describe how much of an effort it's been on all of us. But I think what inspires me is that we've also had incredible volunteers coming in to help us do this. We have a Thai volunteer. Like, he saw our group, he knew how flat out we are. He saw our clean air legislation, it was in Thai. And I told him, I said, we do need to have it translated in English, but I just don't have the capacity to do it at the moment. He took about 2-3 weekends and he translated it all into English.
Wow.
He's not a lawyer, right? But he's got phenomenal English skill. He's an engineer, actually. Yeah, right. So, we have another example. Is this? There's this incredible lady, Anna. She's a book designer based out in Lisbon, in Portugal. She heard about our group through one of these webinars that I did with the Royal Society of the Arts, based in London. When she heard about our group, she just reached out to us and she said, "Oh my God, I want to do something. I want to help out." And I said, "Oh my gosh." And she's like, "My skill set is I'd like to design something for you. Let me know what you want." And she is the designer of the cover of our clean air legislation. Normally, clean air legislations do not have a cover. But we decided to do it very, very specifically for a very clear reason. We don't know if this legislation will ever see the day of light, to be very, very frank. But we do want to make it stand out, and we do want it to be documented there within, throughout the relevant bodies, whether it's the legislature, the court system, parliaments, universities. We've sent it all out there. And so it is there, that it's all documented. So, that people have it to take it up in the future. So I think my point is just, I know it's hard, we all lead very busy lives. But I think we all have different skill sets to bring to the table. And it really depends what you want to do, right? But these things that these individuals have done on their own, unilaterally, has been phenomenal. And it's really, helped us move this movement forward. And I would really encourage anybody who wants to get involved in whatever cause that moves you, that you're passionate about, to just roll up your sleeve and do and get involved. And for us, the one simple thing is we actually have a petition on our website. Our website is thailandcan.org, Can Clean Air Network. And Can is actually, when we started off, we looked around and we didn't know what to call ourselves. And there is actually a group in Hong Kong called HK Can. And we thought, we quite like that name. And we thought, it's very inspiring, right? Because you're lobbying off, taking off President Obama's Yes We Can. So our group is called thailandcan.org. And in there, we have an informal petition. And we want people, anybody actually, it doesn't even have to be anybody in Thailand, but ideally it would be good to be Thais, because then you can really make the noise when things move. But anybody can really go in and then just read all the material. We've got materials in English and Thai. And if you agree with these important things that we've put in the legislation, make your voices heard. And what we want to do right now, we have 60,000 people. This petition's been around for about 5 years now. It's a bit low, actually.
Yeah.
We want to make it up to about 1 million. And I think that would really show, those in power that this is an issue a lot of people care about. And we're aiming for 1 million as a stretch target, because I believe the only other public petition in Thailand that has garnered enough of a big enough mass of people is like 800,000 people have signed. So this would really make noise. So that's a simple thing you can do, right? You can go and listen, click, send it to all your friends, right? And that's simpler than 20 million people walking the streets in the 70s. Yeah. So I encourage people to get involved.
You could say,
I'll promote it. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's in everyone's interest, and that's the easiest thing you can do is sign a petition, right? I sign petitions all the time. I don't know if they make a difference, but I want to support the people who are putting the effort into creating the petitions, because I know it's hard. But it's one thing. It's like we do this show to give voices to people who may not be heard. And one of the problems that we've got in this region is there's so many different languages. And it's not always in English, so people don't necessarily know what's going on, or the way the media works. Half the time I'm part of this global conversation, and most people are in the Northern Hemisphere. They have no idea what's going on in this part of the world, whether it's extreme weather events or actions, because it's coming out in local language versus in English. So the most important thing is we've got to support. Like, I've got friends who are saving elephants. I've got friends who are cleaning beaches and taking care of the environment. I've got you who's trying to get legislation in Parliament in Thailand to clean up the air, which is in everyone's interest. So we've all got to get behind the people who are out there doing this work at their own cost, in their own time, on top of living and trying to earn an income and everything else. So I think the least we can do is, if we're not going to do something ourselves, the least we can do is support the people who are doing something. And that's something I don't see is happening enough at all. Like the people who are really you see the influencers getting millions of likes and shares and posts for posing and pouting. But the people who are really trying to save humanity and life on this planet, they're just not getting the support. So support the champions. They deserve it.
Thanks, Andrea.
Indeed. Indeed.
All right. Final thoughts before we quickly wrap up?
Well, I think one of the things Rena was talking about is she doesn't know if this will see the light of day. And I think that if you only do things that will see the light of day, then nothing's going to change.
That's true.
Yeah, that's very well said. It's that simple, really.
Let's get the support behind you so it does see the light of day. A million people signing your petition. I'll do my part, promise. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be back on Friday the 22nd, and we've got Robert Redmond Hosking from the UK, who's aligned to the Green Party. This is my understanding. I don't know Robert that well, but we're going to talk about the politics of climate, and that could go in any direction, but I think it's going to be a little bit more feisty, which will be great. And I'm really looking forward to it. So come and join us in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, Weena, thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
I'm sending you my energy, because I know it gets really depleted when you do this work. It's exhausting emotionally, physically, in every way. Yeah. You've got champions behind you. We've got people behind you championing you. So thank you
so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. See you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.